Hi, everybody. Welcome to Needed Conversations with Ryan and Victoria. So excited about this series of podcasts that we've been doing on marriage and dating and on expectations versus realities. We talked about the 7 things that you should not expect going into a marriage, kind of those false expectations. That was last week's episode, and now this week we're talking about the 10 things that you should expect. These are the expectations you should have going into a marriage, and really what to do when those expectations aren't met as well.
Yes, those are awesome pointers, and we're so excited that you joined us. And if you're single, those are the good times for you to write those notes down. But the first thing we're going to talk about is that a marriage provides a permanent commitment to each other. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think going into marriage, recognizing that it's not a contract, a piece of paper that you sign that your government recognizes, but it is a covenant that you make. And a covenant is different from a contract in a lot of ways. Firstly, a contract has a set of terms and conditions that if one or the other parties in a contract doesn't fulfill their obligations, then you're free to walk away and you're free to get restitution in this or that or the other. But a covenant is far different, and we can look at the covenants that even God makes with us and say, when God makes a covenant with his people, it doesn't matter if the people don't live up to their end of the bargain, so to speak, but no matter what, you are going to stay committed. Mm-hmm. Now, when I say no matter what, the Bible obviously does give some exceptions for things like infidelity and abuse, of course, in the home, or when a spouse, abandons you for whatever reason and doesn't want to be a part if they're hardened in their heart. But even some of those things can be overcome. We know people who have overcome adultery in their marriage, and it's a very hard thing to do, but it can be done. And through the strength of a covenant and the commitment for unconditional love for one another, you can overcome virtually anything. But it is a permanent commitment. It's supposed to be lifelong.
Yeah, it's definitely a choice driven. I think a lot of times we as human beings want to be feeling driven, but it's definitely a choice. So number 2 is a continual learning of one another. And I love how in your book that you've written, I Love You More, Most, and Forever, how you talk about us transitioning from different seasons of life, and that we cannot become familiar with one another, but we need to step into the outer court, inner court, and then the Holy of Holies again to kind of rediscover one another, because things do change a person, like, loss of a loved one or a change of a job, or, somebody experiences some health issues or whatever struggles that you may be going through. Sometimes that does, change and shape our perception in a different way. And so I think it's important for us not to become too familiar and make sure that we in a continual process of learning, just like life is. We can't settle down and say, oh, we know it all, which is so not true. I think the more you start learning, the more you start seeing how much you're lacking in and how much knowledge you are actually missing out on because you actually started diving into that.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, all of the seasons of our life thrust us into growth, reevaluating of our own lives and what we want to do in life. And that can happen through, like you said, loss, or even having a child, or getting a new job opportunity that's good, but you haven't really discussed how that might affect your relationship. And you give a little bit of time, and both of you change, both of you adapt, both of you grow. And you want to make sure that you're growing together, you're not growing apart. And committing to learning about one another is going to be vital in that growing together process. I knew that when I got married to Victoria, I was enrolling in the school or the University of Victoria, and I would never leave. It would be a lifelong learning. And she did the same for me. We discover one another in each season of our lives. And that's actually what makes it fresh. And we lean on each other through the challenges, and that's what makes us stronger. We don't want to deny each other our individual growth experiences, but at the same time, we don't want to become so disconnected. It's really a balancing act that we lose sight of where our commonalities are, and when it comes down to it, where your marriage is focused. What are we even in this for? So your marriage has to have a mission, and then also, like you said, a continual commitment to learning one another.
That's so good. So number 3 is meaningful communication, which is so important in marriage. And one of the things we have discussed this in previous episodes as well, about how a man and a woman can be so different, and how their perception of a specific thing can be so different because they process information in a different way. And so then you bring in 2 different upbringings that can present a different challenge. So one of the biggest advices that I remember people telling me is like, the biggest advice I can give you for your marriage is just learning to communicate. And I'm like, what are they talking about? Like, I know how to have a conversation or whatever, but I really didn't understand that fully until I got married, and we had challenges along the way and had to express ourselves. And, you do start kind of leaving room for assumptions because you process information in a different way. So you think your spouse thinks a certain way about you, when, we've kind of over the years started saying, well, what does that word mean to you? Because that can mean something different to me because, I'm from a different culture, so sometimes I process information differently. He's from a different culture, and we're just trying to fuse it together. So it's very important for us to have meaningful conversations, not to leave the room when, the challenge is present, but really make sure that we work those things out. And honestly, just have conversation in general. I think sometimes we get so busy doing life that we just like, oh, you do your job, I do my job, we're both pulling our part of the bargain, and then you just kind of start feeling disconnected if you don't make the time to make those meaningful times for you to communicate what you need to express.
Yeah, I tell this with people too, even in their relationship with God. It's easy to have a text message relationship. And even if it's not just relegated to text messages, fragmented conversations that never find a full expression. And when it comes down to communication, it's making the time investment to wrestle with ideas and concepts, to be vulnerable and transparent and uncomfortable. And I say, if you have a problem with communicating, make an intentional effort to put yourself in a situation that would be a little harder to escape from, right? Find a way to get away from your kids if you have kids. Even doing something like getting in a car and going on a day trip, a road trip, saying, let's go a city over, and it may take you an hour to an hour and a half to drive there. Well, that's an hour and a half for there and an hour and a half back where you're stuck in the car with that person and you're forced to communicate. Maybe make a commitment before you get in the car. We're not going to listen to any music on the way there. It's going to be full-on conversation. And either it's going to be awkward silence or it's going to force you out of your shell to say, what's going on with you? What are you into? What concerns you? Learn the art of asking good questions, even if you have to keep a journal for those special times where you say, instead of me kind of asking this person this question on the fly and it turning into an argument because it's really the wrong time, the wrong place, get a little journal going and maybe list some questions, that you might have about your spouse or concerns that you have about your relationship. And then when you get in the car or you find yourself taking a long walk, in the park or something, bring that journal with you and open it up and just start asking one another questions and be open and vulnerable to that process. Don't feel like that it's an interrogation thing. That's important. Like, why were you on the night of such and such, blah, 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 or why are you always making excuses? This isn't an antagonistic thing, but more even pointing back to that continual learning of one another. You want to come prepared to ask good questions, inquisitive questions. What burdens you most about your job right now? What are the challenges that you face every single day when you go in? Some of those inquisitive things that are less a pointing of fingers and more of I want to get to know why. Because that in and of itself may answer the questions that you would have in pointing fingers and blaming. to just say, well, let me step back and get a different perspective. Let me see what's going on in their lives. And then you might have an aha and say, I understand why they got an attitude at this amount of time every day. Because, or I understand why me texting them in the middle of this time is a bad idea, because they're probably getting railed by their boss. All those little things that you don't think about. It's about intentionally communicating and asking the right questions. This really works well with men. Men want to have their intellect stimulated. They want to have meaningful conversations. Most people view men as very silent. I think men are more deep thinkers. And
I guess you have to learn how to not come across as a nagging wife, so to speak,
Yeah.
but as a concerning wife. Like, how can I better, what can I do better to help you carry that burden that you feel every day? And I think that when you try to learn to serve one another, that's going to replicate, that person being able to have more freedom and less anxiety to actually, maybe think about doing a date night or something else like that. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like when a person is so burdened by a specific thing, it's almost like they got this fog in their head and they can't focus on anything else, because if they feel like if they're failing at specific task, then they're like, I don't even know where to begin now, because I feel like that I'm so just bogged down to this one thing and I just feel like I can't get out of it. And I think, all of this kind of, doing all these little steps kind of takes us to number 4, which is friendship. I think that's where friendship stems from. Intimacy is information. So the more time you do spend together, we have, our strong opinions about that. I think when you get married, you shouldn't go off with your girlfriends or your guy friends to, have a good time. I think that it's sad the way, not to say that you shouldn't have friends, but what we're seeing more so is, it's an escape plan. And those friends kind of serve as an avenue for you to vent and express your feelings when they have no idea what's going on in your marriage and they're only hearing your side, technically. So I think that you have to make sure that, when you do when you are intentional about learning one another, having meaningful communications, then all of that kind of brings about that friendship, that throughout the years you start learning one another and what their experiences are and serving one another. That's how I feel like you create a good friendship.
Yeah. And I know a lot of what we're saying requires cooperation.
Yeah.
So it's very preventative if you're at the beginning of your relationship or your marriage, that you can address these things and create habits that will sustain a healthy marriage for the long term. But I also, just sitting here thinking about it, I do understand people who have been in marriage for a long time and have felt ignored or felt like they've hit a brick wall. And when you let so much time pass, it could be 5 years in a crappy marriage. And you're probably listening to us like, what do you mean asking the right questions? He won't even sit down to have a conversation with me. Or what do you mean friendship? I hate their guts,
Yeah.
And I feel you out there, and I don't want you to feel discluded from this, but, serving and making these little acts over a long period of time, it's not going to happen overnight. But you dedicating yourself to these little acts of intention towards them. And basically, it's like body language. If you're watching on YouTube right now, you'll see that I just turned my body from Victoria, right? How the energy goes where your focus is. So even the act of changing your posture about that person over a period of time will begin to soften the barriers between you. Don't think that it's going to happen overnight, but choose, even in your daily activity around this person, and I hope that I'm explaining this well, choose to look at them in the face, looking at them in the eyes when you ask them a question, even if it's as simple of, what would you like for dinner? Look them in the eyes, because when bitterness sets in, we adapt these coping mechanisms so that we don't have to deal with what's in front of us, which is a really sucky marriage. So we start avoiding them with our body language. When we ask them questions, it's while we're doing something like the dishes, and we're talking at them instead of talking to them. So even changing your posture your attitude about them, even if you still have anger towards them, making an intentional effort to forgive and change your posture towards them in an act of service will soften their heart to be able to open these lines of communication one at a time. I felt it was necessary to even stop here and say that to some people because I do understand. Victoria and I have not experienced that because we have put these safeguards in place from the beginning. Granted, that doesn't mean our marriage is perfect, but I don't also want to have these conversations and feel like that there may be someone listening who can't relate to even a cooperative marriage, which I think all of this begins with cooperation, that both of us are showing up to do the work. Sometimes you're the only one doing the work, and that's tough. I feel you out there, but stay committed. Remember to turn your posture towards them, look them in the eyes when you talk to them, and think of ways that you can serve them in an unconditional, I don't want anything in return kind of way. And I promise you, over time, that will chip away at the hardness of their heart, where you can begin to implement some of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think you just addressed number 5, which is willingness to grow. And I think that's what you need is two individuals that are willing to grow, be confronted, be challenged. And that can be tough, especially when you live so many years and you're like, I don't know if I want to hear from this person, it can be tough to swallow certain things when people tell you, like, and they notice certain things, the way you behave or do certain things. It's hard. And I think that's why it's important for us to have, a relationship with God so that you can go back and almost have like a therapy session with God and say, hey, God, like, what do I really need to address with myself? Like, how can I be a better person? And I think that's what we should wake up doing every single day. Like, how can I better serve that person? Because at the end of the day, that's what really counts, is just really showing people unconditional love. And that can be very challenging to show the closest person unconditional love. And that's a person that you're more familiar with,
Yeah,
So.
I think you should definitely have an expectation going into the marriage that is a spoken expectation that we are both committed to personal growth and development, whatever that looks like, whether that comes from reading books, continual education. But I also want to add the preface here that I think sometimes we can put really heavy expectations on our spouse to perform, and that can turn into like a constant need for approval, and that can become very taxing in a relationship. And I say it like this, that it feels like I never make enough money for my spouse, or I feel like that my spouse is always pressuring me to do X, Y, and Z because it will increase our social status, right? And that has nothing to do with growth. And if you're pushing your spouse to, constantly be going for the next on their job, or making the risk to start a business, or maybe that's your thing. Maybe you're the one who's to start a business, and maybe your spouse is called to be an employee. That doesn't mean they're not growing professionally or they're not growing personally, but maybe it means that that's just that they're one who serves a vision instead of has a vision. I think everybody should have personal vision for their life, but not everybody are visionaries, even in a relationship. So women coming into a relationship thinking that your man should have a vision for your house is one thing, for sure, absolutely. But having a vision that is humongous, that gains notoriety, we're living in a world where influence and quote unquote success is idolized, and we can put that undue pressure on our spouse to perform in a way that we see will gain us some type of social notoriety. I think growth is also consistency. I think growth is knowing that they're going to show up, that they have habits and routines that are healthy, that they're not always searching for the next, but there's a sense of satisfaction with where we are.
Yeah.
That if we don't live in $1 million house and we just live in a middle class house, that we're happy with one another. I think sometimes we can chase after these accolades and these financial successes as a sense of avoidance. I'm not saying you shouldn't pursue success in these areas, But you have to address, where is this stemming from? Is it coming from a place of needing to be approved and affirmed by the world? Or, am I competing with my friends because their husband or their spouse just got a promotion and I'm expecting my spouse and I see them having a new car, so we need a new car, and putting undue pressure on the relationship? And then you say, well, they're just not growing. No, you're just being too selfish. No, you're not satisfied with where you're at. Even Victoria and I have adopted a more minimalist mentality about certain things because it's so easy to be competing with the Joneses all the time and feel like you're not growing. But we are growing. Even if I remember back in the day when someone bought a house, that was their lifelong house. Like the house that you bought when you first got married, you were 80 years old and still in that house. My grandpa to this day is living in the house that he grew up in and was passed to him. And
he built onto it.
And he built onto it. And it was a shed with an outhouse when it first started. But when he got married, him and my grandma, they just built something there and they never wanted to leave. And you could call that a lack of growth. But when I look at their marriage, that's the kind of marriage I idolize. That they never were pursuing of things at the expense of their relationship. But they were like, growth means something different for us, that we're not growing in a superficial way. Like there are some weeds that are humongous, that from the surface level, you go out in the yard and you're like, dang, but you start pulling it up, it's shallow. It's not like an oak tree that is deeply embedded into the ground and that growth happens over time. If you want quote unquote fast growth, it's going to be at the expense of a healthy relationship, and you're going to end up with a bunch of weeds to deal with. But if you're in it for the long haul, the slow burn, growth means something far different. We're growing together. We're embedding our roots and our traditions and our values in this household. I know I'm getting on my soapbox here, but what do you think?
That's good. I mean, I think you carried us to number 6, which is most needs being met. And I think you have to be content where you are at. And that's not to say that you can't dream together. But I think you have to ask yourself the question of why do I want, to look forward to something or do something? Like, is it of an ulterior motive? Do I want to show off in front of somebody? Do I want to attain some kind of a status? Do I want affirmation? Do I want applause? I think when you really, cultivate that relationship together and you have a vision and a goal for your marriage, then it doesn't matter what the Joneses are doing, what you're focusing on, and you're spending your time not looking outwards, but looking inwards. Like, what else can we do? How else we can invest, because you're so busy just focusing on, raising your children and raising your family and making sure that you spend your time together. We have 24 hours in a day, and it's already hard to try to fit all that in. Who has time, to sit there and look at somebody else's grass, which may look greener on the other side, but you don't know what they're dealing with, So just learning to be content and growing together. And in the process, I think, you've talked about really walking in your purpose. And one of the biggest purpose things is, the people you're called to serve, and the place that you're put into to do it at. And so one of the places that you're called to serve and the people you're called to serve is in your marriage, your spouse and your children. And that's the place that you should be grounded in. I think because out of that, if there's a healthy growth there, then I think there's going to be a lot of other things that will stem out of it that's going to bring a lot of fulfillment and also success, because that fulfillment will in turn, bring success, what we call success.
I think there's a double-edged sword on that one, when you should expect that your needs are going to be met, but that person is not going to be the one to meet them all. I think that you have to determine the rules of engagement, how you expect this relationship to progress, and who takes what responsibility for what. And knowing that each of you have a personal responsibility to find that your emotional needs are met in God. And then from there, you come together with a different frame of rules that you're going to navigate this relationship with. And it's from a place of, I'm already satisfied in Christ, and this is just an enriching part of my spiritual growth and development. And I think that in order for your needs to be met in a marriage, you have to be honest. And that's number 7 is honesty. You should expect honesty, and you should also expect to be the one who gives honesty as well, in saying, this is where I'm struggling, this is where I need help, this is the offense that I have with you, and not keeping that bottled up inside of you until it explodes one day like a shaken up soda bottle. You want to make sure that you're honest on a daily basis. I have these challenges and I need this help here. And also just being honest about where else can we find honesty relevant in marriage? Go ahead.
Yeah, like you said, just being honest what you want. I think the 7 things that you shouldn't expect in marriage, we've talked about mind reading. And I think it's kind of like, the opposite is just verbalizing and communicating what you truly feel. Because if you're going to suppress it, then there's going to be a lot of disappointment that's going to stem from you not saying what you really want to say. And I think that there's also finesse that comes with being honest. Sometimes, we may grow up and we have like these really bad ways of wording things that can come across very aggressive or defensive. And I think just learning what your spouse responds to so that you don't come across defensive when you do say, honest things. Maybe also finding the right time to say it. Because sometimes, when a man works all day long and he's done exhausted all his time, I think the first thing that he comes down to, or he comes home and you want to we need to talk. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's the best time, and you have kids running around. So just really being honest with yourself, and then also communicating that, but doing it tastefully, and trying to do it, within a good timing so that it can be effective,
Yeah, because definitely you can become very critical of a person.
And you can say that's honesty.
You could say, well, I'm just being honest, right? I'm just being honest that, you don't look as good as you used to. You don't take care of yourself like you used to. There's a better way of addressing some of those things than just a really superficial punch to the gut, which is calling somebody a bad name, or, that's rooted in a different kind of place. And we can talk about that too. So honesty doesn't mean being mean. You can be honest and transparent without being mean.
That's good.
One of the other things you should expect from marriage is sexual exclusivity. That means that you're committed to one another, and that any sexual encounter outside of your marriage is inappropriate. I think that's, for some of us listening to this, that sounds like an obvious. But I think the rules of relationship in the world are becoming very blurred. I think that it's more common than we think, even in Christian households, people who believe in Jesus, but they have a loose and open marriage when it comes to sexual things. I think that sexual experiences within the marriage are very liberal inside of the confines of you and that other person. And when we say sexual exclusivity, we're not just talking about you going and cheating on that person and sleeping around with someone else, but it's also including maybe even pornography into your sex life, or those kind of things that you don't think that that's including somebody else, but it is. And you're allowing your imagination to go in other places. And you would be surprised the number of people who allow themselves to go there for the sense of adventure, or even spicing things up. And people always point to their sex life as the downfall in their marriage. But really, your sex life is a reflection of the rest of your marriage. Most of the times, it's that it's not that you don't have a good sex life. It's that the rest of your marriage sucks, and that's going to come out in your sex life as well.
Yeah, I think when you think about, I'm glad you said that. The first part of your marriage kind of sucks, and then your sex sucks. And I think of it as like foreplay. You know what I mean? Like if you don't get those chip in place, then it's probably going to be awkward. It's probably going to be infrequent. It's probably not going to be something you look forward to at all.
And then you
don't have that relationship.
And then you resort to some of these more extreme sexual acts and start compromising even what you would do, and you say, well, maybe this is going to help our marriage if I do this for them, or if I include this, or even, God forbid, we include another person.
Oh, gosh.
Right? But it does happen.
It does.
I don't want
it really
to.
Does.
And it's not an uncommon thing, and it's not a frowned upon thing in the world. It's very common. You can call it whatever you want, but it happens. But in a marriage where there's a covenant, you should expect sexual exclusivity.
And I think when people think of now that you're married and you're having this sexual exclusivity, that there should not be purity in there as well. And I'm talking about guarding your mind, guarding your words, and guarding where you're going to wander off, the movies you're going to watch, the music you're going to allow yourself to listen to, even together, addressing those things. Again, like Ryan said, pornography, which can really separate that person from and disconnect them completely. I mean, we've had people that we know personally that had a divorce because of that, because when a person completely separates them, it's like they're connected to the sin, and it's just such a strong hold on them. They think they have control over it, and they don't. It's like a controlled substance of some sorts. And so, there's still the boundaries that you still have when you're married, to keep your mind pure, to keep your thoughts pure, not to covet for another man or a woman, that you're focusing on one another. And I think that's where you don't allow the enemy to come in, because the warfare really does happen in the mind. And so if you allow those thoughts, those little things day to day that you do, eventually they will snowball into big things, and you'll, like Ryan said, will start compromising.
Yeah.
But you really would not compromise if you were in your right mind,
Or if your marriage is going well and your sex life is reflecting that sense of friendship that you have throughout the day that we were just talking about, you're not going to question whether or not you need to bring other people or other things into
like we need to spice things up.
Right. You're not going to, because it's satisfying, that it's deeper than it goes more than skin deep. It's deeper. It's intimacy that isn't just an act, but it's a togetherness. And this is a whole thing that we could open up. I know that we are going to address this coming up soon. So let's just keep it moving, because we could talk about this for a while, and it's definitely needed when it comes to marriage. But number 9, what else do we have?
Resolving conflicts. And again, that comes to being willing to resolve conflicts, because I know a lot of times we want to run away into separate corners. I know people that have said that, their spouse runs off, like completely runs off, like drives off somewhere, and then they don't know where they are for a couple hours or days, God forbid. And you shouldn't do that. That's kind of a form of a manipulation. You have to be willing to resolve conflicts, and in those, in those problems, you will find growth too. When you do find and overcome those challenges, you'll see that there is growth on the other side. It's not like we're constantly, having disputes. Disputes are healthy. You are going to have disputes in a marriage. And if you went into marriage thinking that you're not going to argue, you're not going to have these challenges, then you're fooling yourself, because we're both human beings, and we're going to, have our opinions and thoughts about certain things. And, we have to wrestle, as Ryan likes to say, wrestle and come to an agreement. And, sometimes there's compromise in certain things, and it's okay sometimes to disagree. Maybe, there's certain things that God is still working out in you, or maybe, your spouse will then understand eventually. I don't know. I feel like that God knows what he's doing, and that you're going to continue hitting specific things if you don't address them. You know what I mean?
I think conflict is necessary for growth. I think that the tension that the conflict provides forces you to become better and to have stronger character and values, and to question your core beliefs. I think that you should not think that just because you are becoming one in Christ, that you will not have your own vantage point or viewpoints or perspectives. And especially if you're going to 2 different jobs, you're spending more time at your work than you do in a week with your family, that you're not going to be rubbed off on with those type of experiences, and you'll formulate different beliefs. Those arguments and conflicts could stem from political. That's a big thing right now. Our families are being torn apart because of political beliefs, and it could be social media. It could be other type of philosophies. It could be, habits and routines and food and, all kinds of stuff. Those conflicts, though, are good for you as long as you don't, in a narcissistic way, avoid these conflicts or constantly deflect as if nothing is ever your responsibility or your fault. And that can be torturous if you're in that kind of relationship. You almost feel crazy, like it's always me, and it's never, that person never takes responsibility for anything. And I think it's important that both parties come to the table and say, this might even be 90-10. It might be 90% my fault, but you've got 10% stake in this as well. Because it takes two to tango, and even within the conflict, nobody's perfect, so we each have our part to play. Well, let's end on a high note. Number 10 is that when you get married and you have a covenant, that you should expect God's blessings. If you look at the covenant from the Old Testament perspective, which is the Ark of the Covenant, within the tabernacle of Moses, which goes back to my relationship teaching as well. Everywhere that tabernacle went, that Ark of the Covenant, rather, they carried it on the shoulders of the priests on these bars, and it was this gold box. When they would go into war, they would put out that Ark of the Covenant. There was this one story where the Ark of the Covenant fell upon the land of this man. I think his name was Obed-Edom, and overnight, this man's house, because the ark was just sitting in his front yard, his life exploded with blessings, financial blessings, family blessings, etc. And so whenever you're in a covenant with another person and God, that is something that attracts wealth. I was reading something the other day that said something like 75% of marriages
of millionaires.
75% of millionaires are in a kind of first-time marriage situation. And this is, when people think of millionaires or billionaires, your mind goes to the most famous ones. But this was from a book called Everyday Millionaires. You can look it up. He's an associate of, who's the financial guy? Dave Ramsey. I think his name is David something. Anyways, it's called Everyday Millionaires. And he's talking about the people around us who do regular things but end up becoming millionaires. And 75% of millionaires are coming from those who are in first-time marriages. And it's incredible to think and look at statistics and see what benefits stem from being committed.
Oh, another fun statistic I heard Lisa Bouvier say, she said, statistically men that are married, they get like a 10-year lifetime, life years added to them. Like the men that are non-married, they usually die like 10 years early. And she looked at her husband, she's like, see, I thought that you were worth adding 10 years of your life to. So there you go. There's a blessing in that too.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think men are more risk takers in terms of physical feats. And when you have a wife to tell you to slow down every time you're driving, or, is there, that can definitely
I think there's
lower the risk.
There's a collaboration at all times, that it's not like you're doing this on your own. There's, a threefold cord is not easily broken. You preached on the whole thing, is when there's, not just a single strand, that God is in the center, that there's a collaboration and unity that happens in your marriage. Then even when challenges do come, and life does bring us challenges, then when that tension comes, that rope is a lot stronger for you to withhold that stress, and to overcome instead of bust.
Yes. So when you get married, expect blessings, because
yes,
not only is it in the Bible, it's statistically proven.
Yes.
Anyway, so we're so glad that you have been listening in on this series, and we're going to continue in this series next week. So make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you hit that bell notification if you're on YouTube, and share and spread this podcast. There's a lot of people who are listening. Everybody who listens to the podcast has something great to take away from it because, and I know I'm biased because this is our podcast, but I feel like that we lay it out there in a very transparent way. So please share it. I know it's going to bless every person that you share it with. Send it to them on a text message even and saying, listen to this. This is really great info for your marriage.
Yes, and please give us a review. That's going to be another great way for us to spread the word. It's very, very easy. It's free, but we would really, really greatly appreciate it. But yeah.
Make sure you also visit my website, ryancoleempowerment.com. We've got some free resources on there, and then we've got some books and courses on marriage and purpose. You definitely want to take those. They are life-changing. And check out my wife's blog, victoriacole.com. She's got some DIY projects, lifestyle stuff, food recipes, you name it. It's a great place for you to find inspiration for maybe your next project. So
maybe.
We'll see you next time. This has been Needed Conversations.